welcome to the Purple Positivity Podcast for August the 29th, 2018. I am your host, the amazingly adorable Rebecca Thistle, podcasting to you live-ish from my couch in my living room in my apartment, which I call Jeffrey Thistlework. Yes, no, I'm having a kind of weird morning. I woke up and I have no idea what I'm going to talk about on my podcast, and I have a vague idea. Usually I have this whole list of things, but because when I say list, I mean like a mental list, because of where my brain is right now, I just cannot, for the life of me, remember anything. So I was browsing around on Facebook and went, okay, I'll try that. So, feelings, right? There was a post in one of my groups about feelings. I had a teacher, and side note, I had a teacher in high school that used to say it like that. He was very, I don't want to say critical of having feelings. He was critical of how much importance certain people in society placed on feelings, and I think, and the funny thing is that I think this actually, ties into what I want to talk about, because, I had this epiphany, and I shared this back in April. I had this epiphany back in April, that I am ashamed of all of my emotions. All of them. All of them. I feel a feeling, and as soon as I recognize that I'm feeling that feeling, I am ashamed of myself for feeling that feeling. Then I'm ashamed of myself for being ashamed of feeling that feeling, and then so on and so forth and so on. I am ashamed of feelings. And this is something that I've been working on since I had this epiphany. I'm so grateful that I had this epiphany. And it's a very arduous process. Because, there is very few points at any given point during the day when I'm feeling nothing. Where I'm not happy, I'm not sad, I'm not angry, I'm just there. There is so little time to not feel anything. But especially when I feel something very intense. For example, anxiety. I get ashamed of myself for feeling anxious. And I can sit here and say, well, it's not my fault. Maybe it's not my fault. I remember the first time I had a panic attack. I was about 15 years old. And I was living with my dad at the time, and I heard, this is what triggered it, I heard my stepmother's voice downstairs. And I started having a panic attack. And that was the first of many panic attacks I had at the sound of her voice. I had panic attacks, and I went and I told my dad, this is what's happening. He rolled his eyes at me and laughed. Like I was just being melodramatic. Like I was just making things up. And, and I thought back on this a while back. And, what my dad taught me was, you're not allowed to have your emotions. You're not allowed to be anxious. You're not allowed to be scared. And you're crazy if you say anything. People are going to think that you're crazy if you communicate them. And so I was taught, don't feel And if you do feel, for the love of God, don't tell anybody about it, or it's going to make you feel worse, and then you're going to feel worse about feeling worse. And it's going to turn into this cycle. And it wasn't just my dad and my stepmom that enforced this in me. It was my mom and my stepdad. To a certain degree, my grandmother somewhat enforced this in me. And she still was. I remember I was talking to her back in March about some of the problems going on in my life. And I don't think she realized this was what she was doing. And so I'm not really angry at her for it. I really am not. But she basically, not in so many words, but she basically told me that I didn't have a right to feel what I felt about what's going on in my life. I didn't have a right. You shouldn't feel this way, because if you feel this way, it's going to make things worse. And so, since I had this epiphany about my feelings regarding feelings, oh man, I have thought back to, wow, how did all this come about? But ultimately, regardless of how it came about, I'll be 32 years old next month. I'll be 32 years old. And I can't change what's come before. And the people who've caused all these problems, they don't realize that they've caused these problems. B, if they do realize that they've caused these problems, they're going to do whatever they can to say, it ain't my fault. And C, at the end of the day, it's my life, not theirs. I'm an adult. It's not my fault what happened in the past. It is my fault what happens now and how I proceed. So when it comes to moving forward, it's a slow process. I'm getting better about it, but it is a slow process. I've gotten into spats, not really, I don't want to call them fights, but because they're ridiculous. But we've gotten into little argument type things. All caps someone and I. And I get mad, and then I get ashamed about getting mad, and then I get ashamed about getting mad, and I get back into that spiral. And I have to stop myself. I have to really consciously stop myself and go, Becca, you're allowed to feel angry. You're not, you're allowed to feel it. You're allowed to feel it. Whatever you feel is fine. Angry, sad, confused, happy, whatever. You're allowed to feel it. What I'm not allowed to do, I am allowed to do this, but what I refuse to allow myself to do is to wallow in those emotions which don't serve me. I'm allowed to cry. I'm allowed to feel sad, I'm allowed to feel sadness. My grandfather passed away a year ago. And, 3 weeks ago, it was the 1-year anniversary. But, I'm seeing these posts from Facebook from a year ago in my memories. And some of them are very cryptic and some of them are very sparse. But I was in a bad place a year ago. And so seeing these memories on Facebook from a year ago, I'm remembering that. And it brings up that grief all over again. It really does. And I'm allowed to feel that. Something else I saw out on this group, it was in the same post, it was a post further down on the feed. It said, what you resist will persist. And so the more I sit here and say, well, I'm not allowed to feel sad over my grandfather. That was a year ago. He wouldn't want me to feel sad anyways. The more I stuff that down and resist it, the more it's going to keep coming back up. And, you know, like, back on Monday. Excuse me. I talked about, one of the worst days of my life. An event that set into motion 5 years ago. A series of even worse events, which then led to where I am today. But I never talked about what actually happened that night. Like I said, I think I talked about it, maybe not in great detail, with my best friend Allie and maybe my friend Jessica. But I don't think I ever told the story in great detail to anyone. I don't remember telling the story in great detail to anyone. But in telling it out here on this podcast, it was so liberating. It was so cathartic. You know, I mean, I'm not in that situation, and I can look back on that memory with feelings of gratitude and forgiveness. And let me be clear, if you listen to Monday's show, let me be very clear about what I mean by forgiveness. It doesn't mean like, oh yeah, it's okay. No, that was fucked up. There is nothing that will make it not fucked up. It was a fucked up situation. But when I say forgiveness, I mean I refuse to let that memory define me in a negative way. But by talking about it and experiencing it and letting it go, or by talking about it and experiencing it and getting it out of my system, I was able to let it go. And I feel so much lighter, and that's probably part of why I'm just like, whoa, this is weird. I don't know what I'm going to talk about in my next podcast, because I feel like I've said everything that I could possibly say. But I haven't. So, you know, but I'm doing the same thing with all these feelings that I feel.